My former colleague's hand was still stinging from where he'd slapped me across the face at his promotion celebration. 3 hours later, he had no idea that the woman he'd humiliated in front of the entire senior management team was actually the anonymous whistleblower who had just submitted a detailed report to the ethics committee about his fraudulent expense claims. By morning, his corner office would be cleaned out, and his career would be over. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The soft glow of my laptop screen illuminated the stack of financial documents spread across my mahogany desk as I reviewed the quarterly compliance reports for Meridian Consulting Group. The clock on my wall read 11:30 p.m., but I had grown accustomed to these late nights in my role as senior internal auditor. The corner office on the 32nd floor offered a stunning view of the city skyline, each twinkling light representing someone else heading home to their families, while I remained here, ensuring the financial integrity that kept our company running smoothly. I had earned this position through 7 years of meticulous work, starting as a junior analyst, fresh out of graduate school, and climbing steadily through the ranks. My reputation for thoroughness and absolute ethical standards had made me invaluable to the executive team, even if it sometimes made me unpopular with colleagues who preferred to cut corners. Tonight was no different from countless others, except for the nagging concern that had been growing in the back of my mind for the past 6 weeks. The irregularities had started small, barely noticeable discrepancies in expense reports that might have been explained away as clerical errors or honest mistakes, but my trained eye had caught patterns that others might have missed, subtle inconsistencies that suggested something more deliberate was occurring. Someone in the company was manipulating the system, and my investigation had led me to a conclusion I hadn't wanted to reach. Marcus Davidson, the company's rising star and newly appointed director of strategic development, appeared to be systematically defrauding Meridian Consulting Group through falsified expense claims and unauthorized use of company resources. The evidence was damning, meticulously documented in the files that now covered my desk like pieces of a puzzle that painted an increasingly clear picture of calculated theft. Marcus had joined the company 18 months ago, with impressive credentials and the kind of charismatic personality that made executives take notice. He was handsome in that corporate way that suggested expensive suits and regular gym memberships, with sandy brown hair that always looked perfectly styled and a smile that could disarm even the most skeptical board member. His Harvard MBA and previous experience at a Fortune 500 company had fast-tracked him through the promotion process, and everyone seemed to agree that he was destined for great things at Meridian. Everyone except me, apparently. Because while Marcus had been charming his way up the corporate ladder, I had been quietly documenting a pattern of financial impropriety that stretched back almost to his first week on the job. The falsified receipts were sophisticated, clearly created by someone who understood the company's expense management system intimately. Hotel stays that never occurred, client dinners that were actually personal entertainment, travel expenses that corresponded to weekend trips with his girlfriend rather than business meetings. The most egregious discovery had come just last week when I traced a series of consulting fees paid to a shell company that existed only on paper. Marcus had been billing the company for external consulting services that were never rendered, essentially paying himself through a fraudulent vendor account he had established using falsified business registration documents. The total amount stolen was approaching 6 figures, enough to constitute felony fraud in any court of law. What made the situation particularly complex was that Marcus seemed to genuinely believe he was untouchable. His meteoric rise through the company ranks had given him a confidence that bordered on arrogance, and I had witnessed firsthand how he dismissed anyone who questioned his methods or decisions. He had a particular disdain for what he called bean counters, like myself, people whose job it was to ensure compliance and accountability in an organization that valued results above all else. The tension between Marcus and myself had been building for months, ever since I had begun asking pointed questions about certain expense submissions that required additional documentation. He had initially tried to charm his way through my inquiries, flashing that practiced smile and making jokes about bureaucratic red tape. When charm failed, he had resorted to going over my head, complaining to senior management about what he characterized as excessive oversight that was hampering his ability to do his job effectively. Unfortunately for Marcus, my reputation with the executive team was solid enough that his complaints had fallen on deaf ears. Senior Vice President Patricia Wells had made it clear that financial compliance was non-negotiable, regardless of how successful someone's sales numbers might be. This had only served to increase Marcus's frustration with me, leading to increasingly hostile interactions whenever our paths crossed in the office. The breaking point had come during last month's budget review meeting, when I had questioned a series of client entertainment expenses that seemed unusually high and lacked proper documentation. Marcus had responded with barely concealed contempt, suggesting that people who had never worked in sales wouldn't understand the investment required to maintain important client relationships. The implication that I was somehow naive or inexperienced had been insulting enough, but his tone had made it clear that he viewed me as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a colleague doing her job. That meeting had crystallized my determination to pursue the investigation to its logical conclusion. Marcus Davidson might have fooled the executives with his charm and his impressive sales figures, but he hadn't fooled me. The evidence of his fraudulent activities was overwhelming, and I had a professional and ethical obligation to ensure that it was brought to light regardless of the personal consequences. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on me. While Marcus had been stealing money from the company and undermining the financial controls that protected everyone's jobs, he had also been positioning himself as the victim of excessive oversight and bureaucratic interference. His narrative painted people like me as obstacles to success, unnecessary hurdles that prevented talented individuals from reaching their full potential. It was a compelling story that resonated with executives who valued aggressive growth and competitive results. But narratives built on deception have a way of unraveling when confronted with facts, and I had spent the past 6 weeks compiling an unassailable collection of facts. Bank records, forged receipts, falsified vendor agreements, unauthorized expense approvals, and a paper trail that led directly to Marcus Davidson's systematic theft of company resources. The case was so strong that I had already begun preparing my formal report to the Ethics Committee, knowing that once I submitted it, there would be no turning back. The personal cost of pursuing this investigation hadn't escaped my consideration. Marcus was popular with the executive team, and exposing his fraudulent activities would inevitably reflect poorly on the people who had promoted him so quickly. There would be questions about oversight failures and due diligence lapses that had allowed such extensive fraud to occur undetected. Some of those questions would inevitably focus on why the internal audit department had taken so long to identify the problems, even though I had actually caught the irregularities relatively quickly given their sophisticated nature. More concerning was the likelihood that Marcus would not go quietly. He had demonstrated a tendency toward vindictive behavior when crossed, and I had no doubt that he would attempt to discredit me and my findings once the investigation became public. He would probably claim that I had personal motivations for targeting him, that the evidence was circumstantial or taken out of context, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion by someone with a grudge. The strategy wouldn't ultimately succeed, because the evidence was too strong and too well documented to be dismissed, but it would make the process unpleasant and potentially damaging to my own reputation and career prospects. Corporate politics had a way of creating collateral damage, and whistleblowers often found themselves marginalized even when they were ultimately vindicated. Despite these concerns, I knew there was really no choice to be made. My job was to protect the company's financial integrity, and Marcus Davidson represented a clear and ongoing threat to that integrity. The longer his fraudulent activities continued, the greater the potential damage to Meridian Consulting Group's reputation and financial stability. Criminal behavior couldn't be ignored simply because the criminal was charming and successful in other areas of his work. The decision had essentially been made for me the moment I discovered the shell company scheme. That level of sophisticated fraud indicated a criminal mindset that would only become more bold and destructive over time. Marcus wasn't just bending rules or taking advantage of gray areas in company policy. He was actively stealing money through premeditated criminal activity that could expose the company to significant legal and regulatory consequences. I had learned over my years in corporate finance that integrity wasn't just about personal character. It was about the structural foundations that allowed businesses to function effectively. When people in positions of trust began exploiting those foundations for personal gain, the damage extended far beyond the immediate financial losses. Trust was the currency that made everything else possible, and Marcus Davidson was systematically destroying that currency for his own benefit. The upcoming promotion celebration would provide the perfect opportunity to observe Marcus in his moment of triumph. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Blissfully unaware that his career was about to end in spectacular fashion, the irony of the situation was almost poetic. While he celebrated his advancement to a senior executive position, I would be finalizing the report that would strip him of not just his new title, but his entire career in corporate finance. Part of me wondered if Marcus had any inkling of what was coming. His fraud had been sophisticated enough to evade casual detection, but I wasn't sure he fully understood the depth of scrutiny that someone with my background and resources could bring to bear on financial irregularities. He seemed to operate under the assumption that his personal relationships and professional success would insulate him from serious consequences, a dangerous miscalculation that was about to be dramatically exposed. The promotion party itself would be held in the executive conference room on the 40th floor, with the senior management team and selected high performers invited to celebrate Marcus's advancement. I had received an invitation, which wasn't surprising given my position in the company hierarchy, but I hadn't yet decided whether to attend. There was something appealingly symbolic about watching Marcus celebrate his success while knowing that it was all about to come crashing down, but there was also something distasteful about participating in what amounted to a celebration of criminal behavior. Ultimately, I decided that attending would serve a professional purpose. It would give me an opportunity to observe the dynamics between Marcus and the senior executives who had promoted him, which might provide valuable context for understanding how the fraud had gone undetected for so long. It would also allow me to gauge the company's overall culture and attitude toward financial oversight, information that could be crucial for preventing similar problems in the future. The timing of my report submission had been carefully calculated to maximize its impact while minimizing the potential for interference or cover-up attempts. I would submit the formal complaint to the ethics committee immediately after the promotion party, when Marcus would be at his most confident and least prepared for the allegation. The weekend timing would also prevent any immediate attempts at damage control or evidence destruction, giving the investigation team time to secure all relevant documents and digital records. I had spent considerable time ensuring that my report was comprehensive and unassailable, with every allegation supported by multiple sources of evidence and clearly documented chains of custody for all physical material. The formatting followed the company's established protocols for ethics complaints with detailed timelines, financial calculations and exhibits that told a complete story of Marcus's fraudulent activity. It read like a legal brief, which was intentional, since it would likely form the foundation for both internal disciplinary action and external criminal prosecution. The personal satisfaction I felt in completing this investigation was complicated by a genuine sadness about what it represented. Meridian Consulting Group prided itself on maintaining the highest ethical standards, and Marcus's behavior was a betrayal of the trust that made our corporate culture possible. His fraud hadn't just stolen money, it had damaged the integrity that was supposed to distinguish our company from less scrupulous competitors. More than that, Marcus's actions reflected a fundamental disrespect for the colleagues who had supported his career advancement and the clients who had trusted him with their business. Every falsified expense report was a lie told to people who had invested in his success. Every fraudulent transaction was a theft from shareholders who expected their investments to be managed responsibly. The scope of the betrayal became even more apparent when I considered how many people would be affected by the revelation of Marcus's criminal behavior. His direct reports would have their careers disrupted and their professional reputations questioned. The executives who had promoted him would face scrutiny about their judgment and oversight capabilities. The company itself would have to invest significant resources in damage control and system improvements to prevent future fraud, but the alternative to exposing the truth was even worse. Allowing Marcus to continue his fraudulent activities would only increase the eventual damage when his crimes were inevitably discovered. The longer he remained in a position of trust and authority, the more opportunity he would have to refine his methods and expand his criminal enterprise. Early intervention was always preferable to delayed justice, both for the company and for the other employees whose livelihoods depended on Meridian's continued success and reputation. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I took one final look at the evidence files that would soon change so many lives. The documents told a clear story of greed and betrayal, but they also represented something more positive. They were proof that the systems designed to protect corporate integrity actually worked when properly implemented and rigorously maintained. They demonstrated that criminal behavior, no matter how sophisticated or well disguised, would ultimately be detected and punished by people committed to upholding ethical standards. The promotion party was scheduled for Friday evening, which gave me the entire weekend to finalize my report and prepare for the inevitable aftermath. I had already arranged for secure storage of all evidence materials and created backup copies of every document in case there were attempts at intimidation or evidence destruction. My legal background had taught me the importance of protecting the chain of custody and ensuring that all procedures were followed correctly to prevent any technical challenges to the investigation's validity. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made the city feel alive with possibility. I dressed carefully for the day, choosing a navy blue suit that projected professional competence without drawing unnecessary attention. The promotion party would be my final opportunity to observe Marcus in his element before his world collapsed around him, and I wanted to blend into the background while making my own observations about the corporate dynamics that had enabled his fraud. The morning passed normally, with routine meetings and standard administrative tasks that provided a welcome distraction from the weight of what I was about to set in motion. I found myself studying my colleagues differently, wondering how they would react when Marcus's crimes became public knowledge. Some would be shocked and disappointed, others might claim they had suspected something was wrong but hadn't wanted to make accusations without proof. A few would probably express admiration for the sophistication of his scheme, grudging respect for someone who had almost pulled off such an elaborate deception. By late afternoon, preparations for the promotion party were underway in the executive conference room. I could see catering staff arranging tables and setting up a bar through the glass walls that separated the conference space from the main office area. The atmosphere in the office had that Friday evening energy that comes when people are anticipating a celebration and looking forward to the weekend. Marcus himself seemed to be everywhere at once, accepting congratulations from colleagues and basking in the attention that came with his new executive status. He had always been comfortable in social situations, and today his confidence was amplified by genuine achievement. He had successfully navigated the corporate ladder and reached a level of authority and compensation that most people could only dream of achieving. The fact that his success was built on criminal activity didn't diminish his obvious satisfaction with what he had accomplished. Watching him accept praise and congratulations from people who had no idea they were celebrating a criminal felt surreal. Marcus's smile was genuine. His gratitude seemed heartfelt, and his excitement about the new responsibilities and opportunities was clearly authentic. It was a reminder that people are complex, that someone could be simultaneously capable of sophisticated fraud and genuine professional accomplishment. The cognitive dissonance was unsettling. This wasn't a cartoon villain twirling his mustache while planning his next scheme. This was a talented professional who had chosen to supplement his legitimate success with criminal activity. Someone who had compartmentalized his behavior so effectively that he could genuinely enjoy celebrating achievements that were partially built on stolen money. As 6 o'clock approached, I made my way to the executive conference room for what would be Marcus Davidson's last promotion party. The evidence was compiled, the report was nearly complete, and the wheels of justice were about to begin turning. Marcus had no idea that his moment of triumph was actually the calm before a storm that would destroy everything he had worked to build. The irony was perfect, and justice was about to be served. The executive conference room buzzed with the kind of energy that accompanied corporate celebrations, a mixture of genuine camaraderie and calculated networking that defined most companies' social events. The catering staff had transformed the space with elegant table arrangements and a well-stocked bar that reflected Meridian Consulting Group's commitment to presenting a sophisticated image to its employees and clients. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a spectacular view of the city's skyline as the sun began to set, casting everything in warm golden tones that made the gathering feel almost cinematic. I positioned myself near the back of the room, close enough to observe the interactions, but far enough from the center of attention to avoid drawing notice. My role tonight was to watch and listen, to gather final observations about the corporate culture that had allowed Marcus's fraud to flourish undetected for so many months. The information would be valuable for my recommendations about improving oversight and prevention measures once the investigation became public. Marcus stood near the front of the room, surrounded by senior executives and colleagues who had come to celebrate his promotion to Director of Strategic Development. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and his confidence radiated the kind of magnetic appeal that had helped him climb the corporate ladder so quickly. Everyone wanted to shake his hand, offer congratulations, or share stories about working with him on various projects. Senior Vice President Patricia Wells approached the front of the room, carrying a glass of champagne and wearing the kind of satisfied expression that suggested she was personally proud of Marcus's advancement. Patricia had been instrumental in his rapid promotion, and tonight represented validation of her judgment in identifying and nurturing talent within the organization. She had no idea that she was about to become the senior executive most closely associated with promoting a criminal to a position of significant authority and trust. The irony of the situation struck me again as I watched Patricia prepare to make what would undoubtedly be a glowing speech about Marcus's qualifications and potential. Every word of praise she spoke would ultimately serve to highlight the failure of due diligence that had allowed his fraud to go undetected. The more she emphasized his trustworthiness and integrity, the more devastating the eventual revelation would be for both her credibility and the company's reputation. Marcus's girlfriend had arrived fashionably late, wearing a cocktail dress that suggested she was comfortable in these corporate social settings. I recognized her from company holiday parties and other events where spouses and significant others were included, though I had never spoken with her directly. She seemed genuinely proud of Marcus's success, and I found myself wondering how much she knew about the source of his recent financial prosperity. The weekend trips and expensive dinners that had appeared in his fraudulent expense reports might have been explained away as company perks or legitimate business expenses. The guest list included most of the senior management team, along with selected high performers from various departments, who had worked closely with Marcus on important projects. These were the people whose opinions mattered most in the corporate hierarchy, the colleagues whose respect and admiration had helped fuel his rapid advancement. They were also the people who would feel most betrayed and embarrassed when his criminal behavior became public knowledge. I noticed several members of the sales team clustered around Marcus, laughing at his stories and competing for his attention in the way that suggested they saw him as a mentor and role model. His success in landing major clients and exceeding revenue targets had made him something of a legend among the younger salespeople, who studied his techniques and tried to emulate his approach to client development. The fact that some of his success had been achieved through fraudulent expense manipulation would destroy his value as a role model and mentor. The finance team was also well represented at the party, which created an uncomfortable irony given that they would soon be investigating the very person they were here to celebrate. Several of my colleagues from the accounting and audit departments were mingling with Marcus and expressing admiration for his business acumen, completely unaware that they would soon be tasked with quantifying the extent of his theft and developing new controls to prevent similar fraud. As the evening progressed, I found myself studying the dynamics between Marcus and the various executives who had supported his career advancement. The relationships appeared genuine, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to the company's success. These weren't people who had been deceived by an obvious charlatan. They were experienced professionals who had been systematically manipulated by someone sophisticated enough to present a convincing facade of integrity while engaging in criminal behavior. The sophistication of Marcus's deception became even more apparent as I listened to conversations about his various accomplishments and contributions to the company's growth. He had genuinely delivered results in many areas of his work, landing significant new clients and developing innovative approaches to business development that had generated substantial revenue. The criminal activity had been layered on top of legitimate achievements, making it much harder to detect and easier to rationalize. Patricia Wells finally called for attention and began the formal portion of the evening's celebration. Her speech hit all the expected notes, praising Marcus's dedication, intelligence, and leadership potential while emphasizing the company's commitment to promoting talent from within. She spoke about his impressive track record, his innovative thinking, and his bright future with Meridian Consulting Group. Every word would soon seem tragically ironic. But tonight, they reflected genuine belief in Marcus's value to the organization. Marcus's response was gracious and apparently heartfelt, expressing gratitude for the opportunities he had been given and commitment to justifying the confidence that had been placed in him. He spoke about his excitement for the new challenges and responsibilities that came with his promotion, and his determination to continue contributing to the company's success and growth. The speech was delivered with the kind of sincerity that made it impossible to doubt his genuine enthusiasm for his work and his future with the company. As the formal presentations concluded and the party returned to its more casual networking atmosphere, I found myself in the uncomfortable position of accepting congratulations for my own role in the company's success. Several colleagues approached me to discuss various audit projects and compliance initiatives, treating me with the respect that came with my reputation for thoroughness and integrity. The conversations felt surreal given that I was hours away from submitting a report that would fundamentally change the company's understanding of its internal controls and oversight capability. The evening continued with the kind of professional socializing that defined most corporate events, a mixture of work-related discussions and personal conversation that allowed people to build relationships beyond their formal job responsibility. Marcus moved through the crowd with practiced ease, demonstrating the social skills that had contributed to his success while showing no sign of the stress or guilt that might have been expected from someone engaged in systematic criminal activity. I was beginning to consider making my exit when an incident occurred that changed everything about the evening and crystallized my determination to see justice done. A junior analyst named Rebecca Chen had approached Marcus to ask a question about expense reporting procedures, specifically about documentation requirements for client entertainment expenses that exceeded certain thresholds. It was exactly the kind of innocent inquiry that had probably made Marcus nervous about increased scrutiny of his activities. Marcus's response was immediate and disproportionately hostile. Instead of answering Rebecca's question or deflecting it politely, he launched into a condescending lecture about how people who had never worked in sales didn't understand the complexities of client relationship management. His tone was dismissive and contemptuous, designed to embarrass Rebecca in front of the senior executives who were within earshot of the conversation. But Rebecca persisted with her question, explaining that she was simply trying to understand the proper procedures for submitting similar expenses in her own work. The inquiry was reasonable and professional, exactly the kind of clarification that should have been welcomed by someone committed to following company policies. Instead, Marcus's agitation increased visibly, and his response became even more aggressive and personal. The situation escalated quickly from there. Marcus accused Rebecca of questioning his integrity and suggested that her concerns about documentation reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of how business development actually worked. He implied that her focus on procedural details showed a lack of understanding about the big picture thinking that was required for senior-level success. The attack was unprovoked and completely inappropriate, especially in front of senior management. Rebecca handled the situation with remarkable professionalism, attempting to de-escalate the conflict while maintaining her position that proper documentation was important for compliance purposes. She never raised her voice or responded to Marcus's personal attacks with similar hostility, instead continuing to focus on the legitimate business question that had started the conversation. Her composure made Marcus's aggressive behavior appear even more unreasonable and concerning. The breaking point came when Rebecca mentioned that she had been working with the internal audit department to ensure compliance with new expense reporting requirements. The reference to my department seemed to trigger something in Marcus that transformed his inappropriate behavior into something genuinely shocking. Without warning, without any additional provocation, he struck Rebecca across the face with enough force to send her stumbling backward into a nearby table. The slap echoed through the conference room like a gunshot, instantly silencing every conversation and drawing the attention of everyone in attendance. For a moment, the room was completely still, as if time had frozen to allow everyone to process what they had just witnessed. Then chaos erupted as people rushed to help Rebecca and others moved to restrain Marcus, who seemed as shocked by his own actions as everyone else in the room. Patricia Wells took control of the situation with the kind of decisive leadership that had made her successful in corporate management. She immediately ordered Marcus to leave the party and report to her office first thing Monday morning, while directing someone to ensure that Rebecca received any medical attention she might need. The celebration was over, and Marcus's career at Meridian Consulting Group had effectively ended with a single moment of violence that revealed his true character. As Marcus gathered his belongings and prepared to leave under the horrified stares of his colleagues, I felt a cold satisfaction settle over me. The evidence of his financial crimes would have been sufficient to destroy his career, but this act of violence had removed any possibility of sympathy or second chances. He had shown everyone exactly who he really was beneath the charming facade, and there would be no coming back from this moment. The timing was perfect. While Marcus went home to face the consequences of his assault on a colleague, I would be finalizing the report that would expose his systematic theft and fraud. By Monday morning, he would be facing both criminal charges for assault and termination for embezzlement. His promotion celebration had become his resignation party, and justice was about to be served in the most comprehensive way possible. The sweet taste of revenge had never been more satisfying. The silence that followed Marcus's departure from the conference room was deafening, broken only by the soft sounds of Rebecca accepting assistance from concerned colleagues, and the nervous shuffling of executives who were trying to process what they had just witnessed. The elegant celebration had transformed into a crime scene in the span of seconds, and everyone present seemed to understand that they had crossed a threshold from which there would be no return. I remained in my position near the back of the room, observing the aftermath with the clinical detachment that came from years of investigating corporate misconduct. The violence had been shocking, but it had also provided the perfect capstone to months of careful documentation and evidence gathering. Marcus had revealed his true character in the most public and undeniable way possible, eliminating any sympathy or benefit of the doubt that might have complicated his eventual prosecution. Patricia Wells moved through the room with practiced crisis management skills, ensuring that Rebecca received appropriate medical attention while quietly directing other executives to begin damage control procedure. The legal implications of the assault were immediately apparent to everyone present, and I could see the corporate machinery already beginning to shift into protective mode. Marcus Davidson had become a liability that would need to be contained and eliminated as quickly and quietly as possible. Rebecca declined the offer of immediate medical attention, though the red mark on her cheek would undoubtedly develop into a noticeable bruise by morning. Her composure throughout the incident had been remarkable, and her professionalism in the face of unprovoked violence had earned the respect of everyone who witnessed it. She had inadvertently become the catalyst for Marcus's complete downfall, though she had no way of knowing the additional consequences that were about to unfold. As the remaining party guests began to disperse, I approached Patricia Wells to express my concern about the incident and offer my assistance with any internal investigation that might be required. The conversation was brief and professional, but it established my presence at the scene and my availability to provide support during what would obviously be a difficult period for the company. I also made sure to exchange contact information with Rebecca, ostensibly to check on her welfare but actually to ensure that I could coordinate our statements about Marcus's behavior. The walk back to my office felt different than usual, charged with anticipation and the knowledge that everything was about to change. The assault had accelerated my timeline considerably, eliminating the need for careful timing and strategic preparation. Marcus had handed me the perfect opportunity to destroy his career completely, and I intended to take full advantage of his mistake. My office felt like a sanctuary as I closed the door and activated the security locks that would ensure privacy for what I was about to do. The evidence files were exactly where I had left them, organized and ready for submission to the ethics committee. But now they would serve a dual purpose, supporting both the fraud investigation and providing context for understanding Marcus's violent reaction to questions about expense reporting procedure. The formal complaint to the ethics committee was already substantially complete, requiring only minor modifications to reflect the evening's dramatic conclusion. I added a detailed account of the assault incident, including the timeline of events and the names of witnesses who could corroborate the sequence of actions that had led to Marcus's violent outburst. The violence provided crucial context for understanding his psychological state and his willingness to take extreme measures to protect his fraudulent activity. The email submission to the ethics committee was time-stamped at 11:47 p.m., exactly 5 hours, and 12 minutes after Marcus had slapped Rebecca Chen in front of the senior management team. The timing would be significant for investigators trying to understand the relationship between his growing desperation about increased scrutiny and his decision to resort to violence. The pattern suggested someone who was losing control and making increasingly poor decisions under pressure. But the ethics committee complaint was only the beginning of what I had planned for Marcus Davidson. The assault had provided me with additional leverage and opportunities that I intended to exploit fully. His violence had been witnessed by more than 30 people, including several members of the senior executive team who would have no choice but to support immediate termination and potential criminal prosecution. The incident had also created multiple avenues for additional complaints and investigations that would ensure comprehensive destruction of his professional reputation. The first step was to ensure that Rebecca understood the full scope of support available to her for pursuing both civil and criminal remedies against Marcus. I composed a careful email outlining the various legal options, including assault charges, civil litigation for damages, and workplace violence complaints that could be filed with both internal and external authorities. The message was supportive and informative, designed to encourage her to pursue every available avenue for holding Marcus accountable for his action. The second step involved reaching out to my professional network to ensure that word of Marcus's assault and termination would spread throughout the industry as quickly as possible. Corporate finance was a relatively small community, and reputation was everything in our field. A single incident of workplace violence would be sufficient to destroy his prospects for future employment at any reputable firm, but I intended to make sure that the story was accompanied by full details about his fraudulent activities as well. The third step required careful coordination with law enforcement authorities to ensure that both the assault and the embezzlement charges would be pursued simultaneously. I had already established relationships with white-collar crime investigators through previous cases, and I knew that they would be very interested in a case that involved both financial fraud and workplace violence. The combination suggested a pattern of escalating criminal behavior that posed a threat to other potential victims. By 3 a.m., I had set in motion a comprehensive campaign designed to ensure that Marcus Davidson would never work in corporate finance again. The ethics committee complaint would trigger an immediate internal investigation that would result in his termination and recovery of stolen funds. The assault complaint would result in criminal charges that would create a permanent record of violent behavior. The civil litigation would ensure financial consequences that would last for years, and the industry networking would guarantee that his reputation would be destroyed beyond any possibility of rehabilitation. The weekend passed in a blur of strategic communications and careful coordination with various authorities and colleagues. Rebecca had decided to pursue criminal charges, with my encouragement and support, and the police had already begun gathering statements from witnesses to the assault. The contrast between Marcus's charming public persona and his violent private behavior was stark enough to generate significant media interest, which would only amplify the damage to his reputation and career prospects. Patricia Wells had scheduled an emergency meeting for Monday morning to address the assault incident and develop an appropriate response strategy. I made sure to be included in that meeting, ostensibly to provide input on internal investigation procedures, but actually to ensure that my ethics committee complaint would be properly integrated with the company's disciplinary response. The timing would be crucial for maximizing the impact of both the violence and the fraud revelations. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp efficiency that characterized major corporate crises. The news of Marcus's assault on Rebecca had spread throughout the company over the weekend, creating an atmosphere of shock and speculation that made normal business operations nearly impossible. Everyone wanted to know what had happened and what it meant for the company's reputation and leadership structure. The executive conference room where Marcus had celebrated his promotion just 3 days earlier was now the scene of crisis management meetings, designed to contain the damage from his violent outburst. The irony was not lost on anyone present that the same space that had witnessed his moment of triumph was now being used to plan his complete professional destruction. The elegant table arrangements and sophisticated decor served as a reminder of how quickly corporate fortunes could change. Patricia Wells opened the meeting with a somber acknowledgement of the weekend's events, and a commitment to conducting a thorough investigation of all aspects of Marcus's behavior and performance. She emphasized the company's zero-tolerance policy for workplace violence, and assured everyone present that appropriate action would be taken regardless of Marcus's previous contributions to the organization. The message was clear: his assault on Rebecca had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, I waited for the appropriate moment before revealing the existence of my ethics committee complaint and the extensive evidence of Marcus's fraudulent activity. The timing was perfect, coming immediately after Patricia's statements about thorough investigation and comprehensive accountability. The revelation that Marcus's violence was accompanied by systematic financial crimes created a narrative of escalating misconduct that justified the most severe possible consequences. The reaction in the room was immediate and dramatic. Senior executives who had been prepared to handle a single incident of workplace violence suddenly found themselves confronting evidence of sophisticated financial fraud that had been occurring under their noses for more than a year. The scope and sophistication of the embezzlement scheme shocked everyone present, particularly given Marcus's previous reputation for integrity and ethical behavior. The evidence files I presented painted a comprehensive picture of criminal activity that went far beyond simple expense account abuse. The falsified vendor agreements, manipulated bank records, and systematic theft of company resources represented a level of premeditation and sophistication that suggested Marcus had been planning and executing his fraud from almost the moment he joined the company. The assault incident was just the visible tip of an iceberg of criminal behavior that extended much deeper than anyone had imagined. Patricia Wells reviewed the documentation with the kind of focused intensity that had made her successful in senior management. Her questions were sharp and probing, designed to test the strength of the evidence and identify any potential weaknesses that could complicate prosecution or recovery efforts. But the case was airtight, with multiple independent sources of verification and a clear paper trail that led directly to Marcus's fraudulent activities. The decision to terminate Marcus immediately was unanimous and swift. His access to company systems was revoked before the meeting concluded, and security personnel were dispatched to his apartment to recover any company property in his possession. The criminal referral to law enforcement authorities was approved without dissent, and the civil litigation to recover stolen funds was authorized with full executive support. Marcus Davidson's career at Meridian Consulting Group was over, and his career in corporate finance was effectively finished. But my campaign against Marcus was far from complete. The termination and criminal charges were just the beginning of a comprehensive effort to ensure that he would face consequences proportional to the damage he had caused. The assault on Rebecca had provided the emotional catalyst for his destruction, but the systematic fraud represented a betrayal of trust that required a more sustained and thorough response. The next phase of my plan involved coordinating with industry organizations and professional associations to ensure that Marcus's misconduct would be properly documented and communicated throughout the corporate finance community. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners would be very interested in a case study involving someone who had successfully penetrated corporate security measures for an extended period before being detected. The Institute of Internal Auditors would want to understand how the fraud had been identified and investigated as a model for improving detection capabilities at other organizations. I also reached out to the regulatory authorities who oversaw various aspects of corporate financial reporting and compliance. The Securities and Exchange Commission would need to be notified about any potential impact on publicly reported financial statements, and the Internal Revenue Service would be interested in the tax implications of the fraudulent expense claim. Each regulatory agency would conduct its own investigation and potentially impose additional penalties that would compound Marcus's legal and financial problems. The media attention was inevitable given the combination of workplace violence and corporate fraud, and I made sure to provide background information to journalists who were covering the story. The narrative that emerged was devastating for Marcus, a charming and successful executive who had been systematically stealing from his employer while maintaining a facade of integrity and professionalism. The violence against Rebecca was portrayed as the desperate act of someone whose criminal activities were finally being exposed. Within a week, Marcus Davidson had become a cautionary tale about the dangers of inadequate oversight and the importance of maintaining strong internal control. His photograph appeared in newspaper articles about corporate crime, his case was discussed in academic journals about fraud detection, and his name became synonymous with the kind of sophisticated financial misconduct that could devastate companies and communities. The transformation from rising corporate star to notorious criminal was complete and irreversible. The civil litigation proceeded exactly as I had expected, with Marcus's attorneys struggling to mount any meaningful defense against the overwhelming evidence of his fraudulent activity.
The assault charges ensured that any sympathy he might have garnered for being a first-time offender was eliminated, and the pattern of escalating misconduct supported the prosecution's argument for significant criminal penalty. The combination of charges created a legal nightmare that would consume years of his life and most of his financial resources. Rebecca's courage in pursuing criminal charges for the assault had catalyzed a broader investigation that ultimately revealed the full scope of Marcus's misconduct.
Her decision to stand up to his violence had created the opening I needed to ensure that his financial crimes would be fully prosecuted and punished. The parallel legal proceedings reinforced each other, with the fraud evidence supporting the argument that his violence was part of a pattern of escalating criminal behavior, and the assault charges eliminating any possibility of lenient treatment for a white-collar criminal. The recovery of stolen funds proceeded more successfully than anyone had anticipated, largely because Marcus's sophisticated record-keeping had created a detailed audit trail that made asset identification and seizure relatively straightforward. The shell company he had created to facilitate his fraud had maintained meticulous financial records that actually simplified the process of calculating damages and identifying recoverable assets. His attention to detail, which had helped him avoid detection for so long, ultimately became the tool for his complete financial destruction. The professional consequences extended far beyond the immediate legal and financial penalties. Marcus's CPA license was revoked following an expedited disciplinary hearing that focused on both the fraud and the violence. His MBA program Alumni Association formally censured him and removed his name from all recognition lists and publications. The professional organizations he had belonged to expelled him and added his name to databases that would prevent him from obtaining similar memberships in the future. The industry-wide blacklisting was comprehensive and permanent. Every major corporate finance firm received detailed information about Marcus's fraud and violence, ensuring that he would never be hired for any position that involved financial responsibility or client contact. The background check services used by most employers were updated to include his criminal convictions and professional sanctions, creating a permanent barrier to employment in any field that required trust or integrity. The psychological impact of his complete professional destruction was evident in the increasingly desperate attempts his attorneys made to negotiate plea agreements or reduced sentences. Marcus had apparently believed that his charm and previous success would somehow insulate him from serious consequences, and the reality of facing years in prison and permanent professional exile was devastating to his sense of identity and self-worth. The man who had once commanded respect and admiration was now facing a future as a convicted felon with no prospects for meaningful employment. 6 months after the promotion party that had marked the beginning of his downfall, Marcus Davidson pled guilty to multiple felony charges related to both the fraud and the assault. The plea agreement included restitution payments that would consume his assets and earnings for the foreseeable future, community service requirements that would serve as constant reminders of his criminal behavior, and probation conditions that would restrict his movements and activities for years to come. The sentencing hearing was attended by Rebecca, myself, and several other colleagues who wanted to see justice served in person. Marcus's statement to the court was an exercise in self-pity and rationalization, attempting to minimize his responsibility while claiming that stress and pressure had driven him to make poor decisions. The judge was unimpressed by his excuses and imposed the maximum sentence allowed under the plea agreement, noting that his violence against a colleague had eliminated any consideration of leniency for a first-time offender. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs to begin serving his prison sentence, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal revenge and everything to do with justice finally being served. His systematic fraud had stolen money that belonged to shareholders and employees, his violence had traumatized a young professional who had done nothing wrong, and his deception had betrayed the trust of colleagues who had supported his career advancement. The consequences he now faced were proportional to the damage he had caused and appropriate for someone who had chosen to place his own interests above the law and basic human decency. The case became a model for other organizations seeking to improve their fraud detection and prevention capability. The combination of sophisticated financial analysis and coordination with law enforcement authorities had resulted in complete accountability for both the white-collar crimes and the violent behavior. The swift and comprehensive response had also protected the company's reputation and demonstrated to employees that misconduct would be identified and punished regardless of the perpetrator's position or previous contribution. Rebecca had emerged from the experience as a respected advocate for workplace safety and professional ethics. Her courage in standing up to Marcus's violence and pursuing criminal charges had inspired other employees to report misconduct and seek appropriate remedies for workplace abuse. The company had implemented new training programs and support systems based on her suggestions, creating a safer and more supportive environment for all employees. My own reputation had been enhanced by the successful investigation and prosecution of such a sophisticated fraud case. The thoroughness and professionalism of my work had earned recognition from industry organizations and law enforcement agencies, leading to speaking opportunities and consulting arrangements that expanded my influence beyond Meridian Consulting Group. The case had demonstrated the value of rigorous internal controls and the importance of supporting employees who identify and report misconduct. The promotion that Marcus had celebrated so enthusiastically was ultimately awarded to someone with genuine integrity and qualifications, a colleague who had earned advancement through honest work and ethical behavior. The position came with enhanced oversight and control measures designed to prevent the kind of fraud that Marcus had perpetrated, ensuring that future occupants would be subject to the kind of scrutiny that might have detected his crimes much earlier. The conference room where Marcus had slapped Rebecca was renovated and rededicated as a training center for ethics and compliance education. The space that had witnessed both his moment of triumph and his spectacular downfall became a symbol of the company's commitment to maintaining the highest standards of professional conduct. Every employee who attended training sessions in that room learned about the Marcus Davidson case as an example of how quickly a successful career could be destroyed by poor choices and criminal behavior. The comprehensive destruction of Marcus Davidson's life and career had taken exactly 18 months from the moment he had struck Rebecca Chen at his promotion party. The violence had provided the catalyst, but the systematic fraud had supplied the substance for his complete professional annihilation. Every aspect of his misconduct had been thoroughly investigated, prosecuted, and punished, creating a permanent record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Justice had been served in the most complete and satisfying way possible, and I had played a central role in ensuring that a criminal who had betrayed the trust of his colleagues and employer faced appropriate consequences for his actions. The satisfaction of seeing Marcus Davidson reduced from a celebrated executive to a convicted felon was matched only by the knowledge that his destruction had helped protect other potential victims and strengthened the systems designed to prevent similar misconduct in the future. 2 years had passed since Marcus Davidson's spectacular fall from grace, and the corporate landscape at Meridian Consulting Group had transformed in ways that extended far beyond the simple removal of one fraudulent executive. The ripple effects of his crimes and subsequent prosecution catalyzed systemic changes that strengthened the company's ethical foundation, while simultaneously establishing my reputation as someone who could be trusted to protect institutional integrity regardless of personal or political consequence. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office on the 45th floor, a space that reflected both my promotion to Chief Compliance Officer and the company's renewed commitment to maintaining the highest standards of ethical conduct. The view encompassed the entire downtown district, including the courthouse where Marcus had been sentenced and the federal prison where he was currently serving his term. The symbolism wasn't lost on me every morning as I reviewed the compliance reports that now crossed my desk with regularity and thoroughness that would have prevented his fraud from occurring. Rebecca Chen sat across from my mahogany conference table, her transformation from junior analyst to senior ethics coordinator representing one of the most positive outcomes of the entire Marcus Davidson affair. The courage she had shown in standing up to his violence and pursuing criminal charges had inspired a company-wide cultural shift toward speaking truth to power regardless of the personal consequence. Her insights about workplace dynamics and power imbalances had been instrumental in developing the comprehensive ethics training program that was now mandatory for all employees at every level of the organization. The quarterly compliance review we were conducting had become a model for other corporations seeking to implement robust fraud prevention and detection systems. The Marcus Davidson case study was regularly cited in academic literature and professional training programs as an example of how sophisticated financial crimes could be identified through careful analysis and systematic investigation. The methodology I had developed for detecting expense account fraud had been adopted by organizations across multiple industries, preventing countless similar schemes from succeeding. Rebecca's report detailed the implementation of new oversight mechanisms that had already identified and prevented several potential misconduct situations before they could develop into serious problems. The early intervention approach had proven remarkably effective, addressing behavioral issues and ethical lapses at the counseling and training level rather than waiting for criminal activity to occur. The cultural change was evident in employee surveys that showed dramatically increased confidence in reporting mechanisms and trust in management's commitment to addressing misconduct appropriately. The financial recovery from Marcus's fraud had exceeded all expectations, largely due to the comprehensive asset seizure and forfeiture proceedings that had been coordinated with his criminal prosecution. The shell companies he had created to facilitate his theft had actually simplified the process of identifying and recovering stolen funds, since his meticulous record-keeping had provided investigators with detailed documentation of every fraudulent transaction. The recovered money had been used to establish an employee assistance fund that provided support for workers who experienced workplace harassment or violence. Patricia Wells had emerged from the crisis with enhanced credibility and leadership authority, having demonstrated decisive action in addressing the misconduct and implementing systemic reforms to prevent recurrence. Her initial disappointment at having promoted someone who turned out to be a criminal had been transformed into determination to ensure that the company's talent development processes included more rigorous ethical screening and ongoing behavioral monitoring. The executive team had unanimously supported her recommendation to create the Chief Compliance Officer position specifically for me, recognizing that my role in identifying and exposing Marcus's crimes had prevented much more serious damage to the organization. The industry recognition had been gratifying but secondary to the satisfaction of knowing that my work had protected innocent people from further victimization. The Association of Certified Fraud Examiners had presented me with their Excellence in Investigation Award, citing the thoroughness and professionalism of my work on the Marcus Davidson case. The Institute of Internal Auditors had invited me to keynote their national conference, where I spoke about the importance of maintaining independence and objectivity when investigating colleagues and superiors. More meaningful than professional accolades was the knowledge that Marcus's conviction had sent a clear message throughout the corporate community that sophisticated fraud would be detected and punished severely. The publicity surrounding his case had undoubtedly deterred other potential criminals who might have been tempted to exploit perceived weaknesses in corporate oversight systems. The deterrent effect was impossible to quantify precisely, but the feedback I received from colleagues at other companies suggested that the Marcus Davidson prosecution had elevated awareness and concern about fraud risks across the entire industry. The personal cost of pursuing the investigation had been minimal compared to the professional and ethical benefits. Some colleagues had initially questioned whether my thoroughness in documenting Marcus's crimes reflected personal animosity rather than professional duty, but the comprehensive nature of the evidence and the severity of his subsequent violence had vindicated my approach completely. The assault on Rebecca had removed any possibility of criticism for my investigation methods, since it demonstrated beyond doubt that Marcus represented a genuine threat to workplace safety and organizational integrity. Marcus himself had become something of a cautionary tale within the white-collar criminal justice system. His case was regularly cited by prosecutors as an example of how financial crimes often escalated to violence when perpetrators felt threatened by increased scrutiny. The pattern of behavior he had exhibited was now taught in law enforcement training programs as a warning sign that fraud investigations should be conducted with appropriate security measures to protect potential victims of retaliation. The letters Marcus had sent from prison during his first year of incarceration had initially attempted to maintain his innocence and blame external pressures for his poor decisions. The correspondence had gradually evolved into acknowledgments of responsibility and expressions of remorse,
though whether these represented genuine rehabilitation or calculated attempts to influence parole proceedings remained unclear. I had declined to respond to any of his communications, maintaining the professional distance that was appropriate given my role in his prosecution and the ongoing civil litigation related to asset recovery. Rebecca had also received several letters from Marcus, ranging from self-serving apologies to attempts at emotional manipulation designed to make her feel guilty for pursuing criminal charges. Her response had been to forward all correspondence to the prosecutors and victim services coordinators, maintaining detailed documentation that could be used to demonstrate ongoing harassment if his behavior escalated. The letters had actually strengthened the case for maximum sentencing, since they showed a continuing pattern of attempting to intimidate and manipulate his victim. The media attention surrounding the case had gradually diminished as other corporate scandals captured public interest, but the Marcus Davidson story remained a significant reference point for discussions about workplace violence and corporate fraud. Journalists writing about similar cases regularly contacted me for expert commentary, and I had become a recognized authority on the intersection between financial crimes and workplace safety. The platform had allowed me to advocate for stronger protections for employees who report misconduct and more comprehensive background screening for executives in positions of financial responsibility. The company's stock price had initially declined following the revelation of Marcus's fraud, but the swift and comprehensive response to the crisis had actually enhanced investor confidence in management's commitment to ethical operation. The transparency with which the investigation had been conducted and the thoroughness of the reforms that were implemented had demonstrated institutional integrity that distinguished Meridian Consulting Group from competitors who might have attempted to minimize or conceal similar problems. The long-term impact on company valuation had been positive, validating the decision to pursue complete accountability rather than attempting damage control. The promotion celebration for Marcus's replacement had been a deliberately understated affair, held in the same conference room where his violent outburst had occurred but redesigned as a training center for ethics and compliance education. The symbolism was intentional, marking the transformation of a space associated with criminal behavior into one dedicated to preventing similar misconduct. The new director of strategic development was a woman with impeccable credentials and a reputation for absolute integrity, someone whose promotion had been earned through genuine merit rather than charm and deception. Employee morale had actually improved significantly following Marcus's termination and conviction, contrary to what might have been expected after such a traumatic workplace incident. Surveys showed that staff members felt safer and more confident that misconduct would be appropriately addressed, leading to increased reporting of concerns and greater willingness to challenge inappropriate behavior. The cultural shift toward accountability and transparency had created an environment where ethical employees felt supported and protected while potential wrongdoers understood that misconduct would have serious consequences. The training programs developed in response to the Marcus Davidson case had become a model for other organizations seeking to strengthen their ethical culture. The curriculum addressed not only technical aspects of fraud prevention and detection but also the psychological and social factors that enabled misconduct to occur and persist. The emphasis on bystander intervention and reporting obligations had empowered employees at every level to take responsibility for maintaining workplace integrity rather than assuming that oversight was solely the responsibility of management and compliance personnel. Rebecca's recovery from the assault had been complete, both physically and emotionally, though the experience had fundamentally changed her perspective on workplace dynamics and power relationships. Her insights about the subtle forms of intimidation and manipulation that preceded Marcus's physical violence had informed policy changes that addressed harassment and abuse before they escalated to criminal behavior. Her willingness to speak publicly about her experience had inspired other victims of workplace violence to come forward and seek appropriate remedy. The legal precedents established by Marcus's prosecution had strengthened the framework for addressing corporate fraud and workplace violence in coordinated criminal proceedings. The prosecutors had successfully argued that his financial crimes and violent behavior represented a pattern of escalating misconduct that justified enhanced penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. The case had become a textbook example of how white-collar crimes could be connected to threats against victim safety and prosecuted accordingly.
The civil litigation related to asset recovery had concluded with a comprehensive settlement that included not only restitution for stolen funds, but also punitive damages that reflected the broader harm caused by Marcus's misconduct. The financial penalties had been severe enough to serve as a meaningful deterrent to other potential fraudsters while providing resources for strengthening the company's compliance and prevention capability. The settlement terms included ongoing monitoring requirements that would ensure Marcus's compliance with restitution obligations even after his release from prison. My role in the investigation and prosecution had established relationships with law enforcement agencies that continued to provide value for the company and the broader corporate community. Federal investigators regularly consulted with me about fraud detection techniques and case development strategies, while prosecutors sought my expertise for training programs designed to help attorneys understand the complexities of corporate financial systems. The collaborative approach had enhanced the effectiveness of white-collar crime enforcement, while providing valuable insights for improving private sector prevention efforts. The academic recognition had been equally rewarding, with several universities inviting me to teach courses on fraud investigation and corporate ethics. The case studies developed from the Marcus Davidson investigation had become standard curriculum materials for accounting and business students, ensuring that future professionals would understand both the techniques used by fraudsters and the methods available for detecting and preventing such crimes. The educational impact would extend far beyond any single organization or investigation. 3 months ago, I had received notification that Marcus would be eligible for parole consideration within the next year, having served the minimum portion of his sentence required under federal guidelines. The parole board would consider factors including his behavior in prison, evidence of rehabilitation, and risk of reoffending when making their determination. Rebecca and I had both submitted victim impact statements opposing early release, citing concerns about his pattern of manipulation and the ongoing impact of his crimes on workplace safety and corporate integrity. The possibility of Marcus's eventual release had prompted renewed attention to the security measures and monitoring systems that would be necessary to protect potential victims from retaliation or renewed criminal activity. The conditions of his supervised release would likely include restrictions on his ability to work in positions involving financial responsibility or access to corporate resources, effectively making permanent the employment barriers that had already been established through professional sanctions and industry blacklisting. The satisfaction I felt when contemplating Marcus's current circumstances was not derived from personal vindictiveness, but from the knowledge that justice had been served comprehensively and appropriately. His violence against Rebecca had triggered consequences that were proportional to the full scope of his misconduct, while his systematic fraud had been punished with penalties that reflected the sophisticated nature of his crimes and the breach of trust they represent. The criminal justice system had functioned exactly as intended, protecting society from someone who had demonstrated willingness to harm others for personal gain. The transformation of my own career trajectory had been remarkable, moving from a skilled but relatively anonymous internal auditor to a recognized expert in corporate ethics and fraud prevention. The professional opportunities that had emerged from my role in the Marcus Davidson investigation had provided platforms for advocating reforms that would protect other potential victims, while strengthening the integrity of corporate financial systems. The personal satisfaction derived from this broader impact far exceeded any individual achievement or recognition. Looking ahead, the initiatives currently under development would further enhance the company's ability to prevent misconduct while supporting employees who identified and reported concern. The anonymous reporting system had been upgraded with advanced analytics that could identify patterns suggesting coordinated misconduct or systematic abuse. The investigation protocols had been refined to ensure rapid response while maintaining appropriate due process protections for all parties involved. Rebecca's appointment to lead the company's new workplace safety initiative represented another positive outcome from the Marcus Davidson case. Her combination of technical expertise and personal experience with workplace violence had uniquely qualified her to develop comprehensive programs for preventing harassment and abuse, while supporting victims who needed assistance.
The initiative had already received recognition from industry organizations and government agencies as a model for addressing workplace safety and corporate environment. The annual compliance conference scheduled for next month would feature a panel discussion about lessons learned from the Marcus Davidson case, with participation from law enforcement officials, corporate executives, and academic researchers who had studied various aspects of the investigation and prosecution. The discussion would focus on best practices for fraud detection, coordination between private and public sector investigators, and support services for victims of workplace violence. The knowledge sharing would benefit organizations across multiple industries while honoring the courage shown by everyone who had contributed to achieving justice. The corner office where I now worked each day served as a daily reminder of how dramatically circumstances could change when people chose to act with integrity and courage rather than accepting misconduct as inevitable or unchangeable. The view of the city skyline included landmarks that had played roles in Marcus's downfall, from the courthouse where he had been sentenced to the federal building where investigators had coordinated the complex financial analysis that had unraveled his fraudulent scheme. The physical reminders reinforced my commitment to maintaining the vigilance and determination that had made justice possible. 6 months from now, Marcus Davidson would face his parole hearing where the consequences of his violence and fraud would be weighed against whatever evidence of rehabilitation he might present. Regardless of the outcome, his professional reputation would remain permanently destroyed. His financial resources would be subject to ongoing restitution obligations, and his criminal record would serve as a permanent barrier to positions requiring trust or responsibility. The comprehensive nature of his downfall had ensured that the punishment fit not just the immediate crimes, but the broader pattern of deception and betrayal that had characterized his entire relationship with the organization. The satisfaction of having played a central role in achieving such complete justice remained as powerful today as it had been during the investigation and prosecution phases. Marcus Davidson had learned that charm and manipulation could not overcome evidence and accountability, while Rebecca Chen had demonstrated that courage in the face of violence could catalyze systemic changes that protected countless other potential victims. The case had proven that individuals with integrity and determination could successfully challenge powerful people who believed themselves above consequence. As I concluded another successful day in my role as Chief Compliance Officer, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from a dedicated but relatively unknown internal auditor to a recognized leader in corporate ethics and fraud prevention. The Marcus Davidson investigation had been the defining professional experience of my career, demonstrating that thorough preparation, careful documentation, and unwavering commitment to justice could overcome even the most sophisticated attempts at deception and manipulation. The final chapter of Marcus's story remained to be written, but the most important outcomes had already been achieved. His victims had received justice, his crimes had been punished appropriately, and the systems designed to prevent similar misconduct had been strengthened significantly. The personal satisfaction derived from these accomplishments would endure long after the details of specific investigations and prosecutions had faded from public memory. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities to protect organizational integrity while supporting employees who were committed to maintaining ethical standards. The experience gained from the Marcus Davidson case had prepared me to handle whatever complex situations might arise, confident in the knowledge that truth and justice would ultimately prevail when good people were willing to stand up and do what was right regardless of the personal cost or political consequences. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.